You could feast all day on those babies and never go hungry. But Led Zeppelin had thrown him an emotional curve. Their songs hit him deep. There was something dark and sensual about them, something strangely provocative in their nature. They rolled over him, allowing his imagination to run wild. Small wonder that they'd erupted via Jimmy Page. He knew all about Page, a guitar virtuoso in the tradition of Clapton, Stills, and Jimmy's itchy alter ego, Jeff Beck, with whom Page had served a brief but stormy stretch in the Yardbirds as that seminal band was coming apart at the seams. There was already a heady mystique about Page. He'd contributed uncredited licks to scores of hit records, not least on sessions with The Who, The Kinks, and Them. But Page had taken Led Zeppelin into another dimension, a province of rock and roll that was hard to define. Sometimes it was basic and bluesy, sometimes improvisational, other times a hybrid strain they were calling heavy metal, and all of it seasoned with enough folk, funk, and rockabilly elements to blur the lines. That was a lot to take in for a budding rock and roller. Seeing Page and his band would help put things in perspective. It was dark by the time he pulled up at the gig, a club called the Tea Party, in a converted Unitarian meeting house cum synagogue that stood halfway along a solitary street. A hallucinatory gloom had fallen over the south end of Boston, casting East Berkeley Street in a desolate embrace. This was not the Boston of wealthy Brahmins, of culture and entitlement. It was a tough neighborhood, a place you didn't want to hang out at night, says Don Law, who ran the joint. There was no sign of life in the surrounding tenements aside from a bodega next door, whose light threw a waxy fluorescence across the pitted sidewalk. In the silhouette it projected, he could make out the outlines of heads, shoulders hunched against the cold, stretching down the street and around the corner. There must have been, a couple hundred people waiting in line to get in. More. Where the hell did everyone come from? Led Zeppelin was hardly a household name. Until recently, they'd actually been billing themselves as the New Yardbirds. Their debut album had been released only 2 weeks earlier. Sure, he'd expected the freaks and the diehards, but this turnout was way off the chart. Obviously, word had rumbled out along the jungle drums. It wasn't unheard of. We'd have a totally unknown British act open on Thursday, Don Law recalls, and there'd be lines down the street by Saturday. He'd seen it with Jethro Tull, Humble Pie, and 10 Years After, all of whom had played the club during the past few months. Radio helped to a large degree. Boston's FM rock venue, WBCN, was still a novelty, in its infancy. Most of its broadcasts were piped right out of an anteroom at the Tea Party, its jocks a ragtag assortment of ex-college kids from the communications departments at Tufts and Emerson. Bands would come off the stage and do an on-the-spot interview. FM airplay of any good album had become one of the surefire weapons to launch a new act. With Led Zeppelin, the evidence was right there on the sidewalk. Getting into the Tea Party for their final performance was going to take some doing. The lines looked daunting. The hitchhiker feared he'd arrived too late. Fortunately, Henry Smith had been on the lookout for him near the door, and the two men disappeared inside before management, or the fire department, could cut off admission. You could tell from the vibe. An air of expectancy pulsed through the room. The crowd was on top of it. They were ready. The Tea Party wasn't the most conventional place to showcase a band like this one. It was hard to get past its house of worship layout. The stage was a former pulpit, with the legend, "Praise ye the Lord," chiseled above the altar. The ballroom floor was pockmarked where pews had been removed, and a huge stained glass window sported the Star of David. If the music piped over the PA system wasn't exactly liturgical, the psychedelic light show beaming liquid designs from the overhead balcony was downright profane. No service had ever packed in a congregation like the one thronging the hall. The club was legally outfitted to hold 700, but the audience had long ago exceeded that number. The crowd was back to back,